has political liberation actually translated into true economic empowerment? Or, are we really just looking at symbolic representation? When we're talking about post-apartheid South Africa, that is literally the million-dollar question. Is the economic transformation of the nation a real, tangible thing, or does it just kind of look different on the surface? Well, the answer is incredibly complex. It's definitely much more than just symbolic. But structurally, it remains deeply, deeply incomplete. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a completely objective examination of South Africa's complex post-apartheid economic reality. We are going to map out what you might call the unfinished arc of this historic transformation. We'll be looking closely at what has genuinely changed, what has stubbornly stayed the exact same, and why that ultimate goal, full economic democratization, still remains just out of reach. All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The promise of empowerment. 2. Where power remains concentrated. 3. The narrow empowerment problem. 4. Structural barriers to change. And finally, 5. Representation versus transformation. Okay, let's jump right into part 1, the promise of empowerment, looking specifically at the material gains made after apartheid. Look, we really have to start by acknowledging that empowerment here has been undeniably real in a few massive ways. First off, state power shifted fundamentally to a democratically elected black leadership, primarily the ANC. That's huge. Second, public sector access just exploded. We're talking millions of black South Africans entering roles in education, healthcare, and administration, sectors that were previously completely walled off to them. And this expansion, it directly fueled the rapid growth of a robust black middle class in those immediate post-apartheid years. Finally, corporate participation increased too, through new ownership stakes and board representation. Make no mistake, these are absolutely massive material gains that completely altered who gets to participate in the economy and, crucially, who gets to make the big decisions. Moving on to part 2, where power remains concentrated. Let's look at the limits of this change. So despite all those incredible gains we just talked about, core economic power hasn't fundamentally shifted. Capital ownership, and by that I mean the big stuff, land, major firms, financial assets, it remains highly uneven. High-value sectors like finance, mining, and advanced industry, they're still overwhelmingly dominated by established networks. And because of this dynamic, wealth inequality in South Africa remains among the very highest globally. It kind of boils down to this. You can change a government overnight, but shifting the absolute bedrock of generational wealth, yeah, that takes decades. Which brings us to part 3, the narrow empowerment problem and what we call the perception gap. To tackle these historical imbalances, Black economic empowerment, or BEE policies, were introduced. Now, did they create upward mobility? Absolutely, but often in a very narrow, elite-centered way. You see, the early deals tended to favor a few politically connected individuals rather than driving broad-based transformation like, say, widespread entrepreneurship or employee ownership trusts. So, what was the result? A relatively small group gained significant wealth and influence, while the vast majority of everyday citizens experienced very little direct economic uplift from the policies. And this creates a really stark perception gap that pretty much defines South Africa's current economic landscape. It's like looking at two different worlds. At the top, you've got highly visible success, executives, politicians, a thriving upper and middle class. But down at the bottom, there's just persistent poverty and exclusion. If you only look at the top, the transformation looks completely finished. But if you only look at the bottom, it feels like nothing has changed at all. This wild duality is the very heart of the narrow empowerment problem. All right, part 4, structural barriers to change. Why does this inequality stubbornly persist? So why haven't these well-intentioned policies reached the majority? Well, it comes down to deep structural barriers. First, you have profound education and skills gaps rooted in historical laws like the Ubuntu Education Act, which literally intentionally limited Black educational potential to manual labor. Then, there's spatial inequality. Because of historical urban planning, people are physically separated from economic hubs. That forces them to spend huge chunks of their limited income and time just commuting to go look for a job. Add in alarmingly high youth unemployment, tough global economic constraints, and governance weaknesses that drain public resources, and you've got a massive anchor holding back widespread economic transformation. Finally, let's get into part 5, representation versus transformation, which defines the core debate today. Let's actually pause here for a second and define our terms, because this distinction is everything. Symbolic representation is all about visibility. Who is visibly sitting in positions of power? Economic empowerment, on the other hand, is about the mechanics, who actually owns, earns, and controls the resources. Once we understand that distinction, it becomes so clear why the debate over South Africa's progress continues. It's not that nothing changed, it's that the visibility of change has moved way, way faster than the reality of who actually controls the resources. To really grasp how we got here, we've got to rewind a bit. Think back to the Nelson Mandela era. What did that transition actually require? Massive trade-offs. Step 1 was prioritizing political stability to prevent all-out conflict. Step 2 was establishing institutional legitimacy so this brand new democracy could even function. But step 3 was accepting gradual economic change. It successfully enabled a peaceful transition, sure, but it meant deep, fundamental economic restructuring had to be put on the back burner. The structural outcomes we're seeing today are the direct result of prioritizing stability during an incredibly fragile time. Okay, so what does the final balance sheet actually look like for South Africa today? Well, if we look at representation, it is strong. Access and participation have expanded incredibly. On empowerment, it's partial. The gains are totally real and material, but they're highly concentrated. And on transformation, it remains incomplete. Because structural inequality still persists, the economy hasn't yet fundamentally redistributed power across the entirety of society. Which leaves us with this final, really powerful thought from our source material. South Africa has achieved political democracy and partial economic inclusion, but not full economic democratization. It truly is an unfinished arc. The political liberation was an absolute, monumental triumph for sure. But the burning question remains, what is it going to take to finally break down those structural barriers and turn partial inclusion into true, full economic democratization for everyone?